I thank the honourable member for Blaxland. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Berowra and the Father of the House.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise to support the bill, the Telecommunications Interception and Access Amendment Data Retention Bill of 2014, and I will support the amendments necessary to secure its passage. My view, as a former Attorney-General of this country, as a person who has taken very considerable interest in these matters, is that this legislation is absolutely essential. There was an urgent need for it some time ago, and that need remains very prescient now. It's been said by the Speaker before me, the member for Blaxland, that there are 500,000 requests for access to metadata now. And he suggests that that means that the scheme is working perfectly well and adequate for the purpose. Nothing could be further from the truth. I don't think we've been given accurate evidence because it would undermine confidence, public confidence in the nature of our legal system were it to be put in the public arena. But I suspect we have seen a very significant degrading in our capability and capacity to be able to deal with terrorist threats, organised criminal activity, because those people who pose a threat to us know that there are some communications that can be accessed through the existing metadata regime, and there are other communications, because there is no legislation requiring people to keep the data, that are not the subject of scrutiny. Very clear. If you were a terrorist and you wanted to ensure that nobody was able to be aware that you were engaged in those activities and whom you might be talking to, you'd simply identify those agencies who supplied a service that did not keep the information because they were not required to keep the information. It is certainly the case that information has been kept by Telstra, by Optus, because it's been part of their commercial model over a long period of time. It is the case that there are others who said, look, aren't we smart? We've found a way of providing a cheaper service and undercutting their model by not doing all the things that they do. If we don't keep the data, we can be more competitive. Aren't we smart? To my way of thinking, that commercial model is not in the national interest. And the legislation that we are dealing with is to require those organisations to keep that data now, and we are going to pay for it. We may not pay for it directly in its entirety, but we will pay for it through subsidy and through increased cost in the services. It may mean that some of those who thought they had a very good commercial model are going to lose it. But we need to understand that when we see a lot of the media coverage on these issues raising all sorts of fears, and they do, there are commercial reasons why certain organisations are putting that into the public arena. I opened the media section of the Australian newspaper, March 9, dealing with metadata. And rivals unite against data retention. Journalists and their sources could now be tracked down in witch hunts reminiscent of the Stalin era under new metadata legislation. The most powerful media bosses have warned. I go to others. Polls highlight business fears over metadata. Australians don't trust government departments to correctly handle their personal information once controversial new data retention legislation is implemented. Somebody else who wants to get into the business. Phone internet spying violates human rights, says Wikipedia co-founder, an influential technology entrepreneur, Jimmy Wakes, who has slammed the plan to make telcos store the data on every phone and internet users as human rights violations. I mean, if these human rights violations have been there over the last 30 years, why was it an issue in this parliament every day as they were brought to notice, as people who were concerned about it were identifying the abuse? You'd think you'd have heard it. I've been here all that time and I've never heard it. Not raised by the opposition, not raised by the newspapers, until there was a commercial reason why some people need to undermine putting in place a comprehensive regime. If you think I am strongly convinced that this is necessary, you bet. I am concerned about people's rights to privacy. Of course I am. I recognise the arguments about protection of privacy need to be proportional. I want to weigh it up against other rights that I have. And one of those rights I believe I have is the right to life. And I tell you, if I'm going to give up a little bit of privacy to be able to continue living, I would be well prepared to accept it. I'll tell you where I do get concerned about privacy issues, and I never hear it raised, is those commercial organisations who think they can make a profit out of selling some information they get about my user of particular products or where I might shop, and they sell it on to somebody else to make money. I don't hear anybody complaining about that. I would like to think that members who would like to inform themselves, and I can't inform them from what I might know from agencies who have to be careful about identifying potential weaknesses in their own operations, where they may not be able to adequately fulfil the role that we are expecting of them. I don't think that data is going to be out there in the public arena given in evidence before parliamentary committees. It's very difficult to get the arguments about the threats that we face. But I would encourage members to read The Economist of the 17th of January. I found it quite a fascinating article. For copyright reasons, I better say it's published in The Economist, but there is no byline. I don't know who wrote it, but I regard The Economist as being very authoritative. Dealing with counter-terrorism, it says it's getting harder. Western security agencies are losing capabilities they used to once count on. Once the shock of a terrorist outrage generates and begins to fade, questions start to be asked about whether security services could have done better in protecting it. Nearly all the perpetrators of recent attacks in the West were people the security services of their various countries already knew about. And it spoke about the issues recently in France, the French Internal Security Agency and police, who knew certain people to be radicalised and potentially dangerous, yet their plots, which probably involved more people and may have been triggered by either al-Qaeda or in Yemen or the so-called Islamic State, ISIS, in Syria, went undiscovered. There may have been a blunder. There will undoubtedly be lessons to be learned, as there were in Britain after the 2013 murder of Fusilier Lee Rigby. And there they said the parties involved were known to MI5. But it's worth reflecting on the extent to which Western security agencies have succeeded in keeping their country safe in the 13 years since September 2001. It's worth noting their job looks set to get harder. Goes on that Europe has suffered many Islamic terrorist attacks in recent years, but before the assault on Charlie Hebdo, only 2 of them caused more than 10 deaths. The Madrid train attack in May 2004 and the London tube and bus bombings 14 months later. It was not for want of trying, intelligence sources say. They have been thwarting several big plots for years. Sometimes this has meant arresting the people involved. More than 140 people have been convicted of terrorist-related offences in Britain since 2010. But often plots have been disrupted in order to protect the public before authorities have enough evidence to bring charges. These factors threaten this broadly reassuring success. The article goes on to talk about a second problem that we are facing now. The second problem for security agencies is that the nature of terrorist attacks has changed. Al-Qaeda, and in particular its Yemeni offshoot, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, is still keen on complex plots involving explosions and airlines. But others prefer the use of fewer people, such as commando-style raids, such as the one on the Charlie Hebdo and the lone wolf attacks that are not linked to any organisation. IS has called for attacks on soft targets in the West by any means available, and one method is to drive a car into pedestrians, as we saw in Dijon in December 21 last year. At any one time, MI5 and the French agency will be keeping an eye on around 3,000 people who range from fairly low priority targets, people who hold extremist views or may not one day be put into practice, though those who have attended training camps or have been involved in terrorist activity in the past and are thought to be more likely to be planning an attack will be kept under greater notice. Only a small number at the top are subjected to intense resource surveillance. I mean, these are pretty simple issues. 3,000 people. We've got an agency which has around about 1,500 people that is meant to be protecting us. Could it put 3,000 people thought to be posing a risk under scrutiny? It's obvious they can't. They have to have other ways of finding out how they should target their activities more appropriately. And this is why, as the article goes on, even when there are identified conspirators, it's getting harder to tell what they might be up to. This is because of the third factor that is worrying the heads of Western security agencies: the increasing difficulty they are having in monitoring the communications within terrorist networks. The explosion of often encrypted new means of communication, from Skype to gaming forums to WhatsApp, has made surveillance far more technically demanding and, in some instances, almost impossible. The article goes on. These tech firms are very different from the once publicly owned telephone communication companies that spooks used to work with and which were always happy to keep a wiretap when asked. Some, especially the smaller ones, have strong libertarian distrust of government. Technology tends to move faster than legislation, and although security agencies may have some ways into new systems, others will simply stymie from the modern equivalent of steaming envelopes open. It's an article worth reading to give you an idea of the difficulty in which the agencies who have a responsibility to protect us are working. This legislation is important because it is about giving them the tools that they once had again. I think the legislation is absolutely prudent, appropriate, measured and responsible. I know we are amending it. I suspect those amendments, which are going to be agreed to ensure we get the passage of the legislation, are not necessarily required and are going to impose significant and additional costs upon the Australian taxpayer. I hope people will look at these issues in the context of where the problems of the past have been, because I can assure you there is no need for the sort of scrutiny that people are demanding.